I didn't go to college to fight a war. I went to breathe, to get distance from the town where every street had my family's arguments carved into them, and every grocery clerk knew how my father answered the door when bills showed up. I went because I've always been good at seeing how pieces fit, and because engineering felt like a language I could learn that wouldn't ask me to confess anything about myself. I went because the catalog said there would be professors who loved what they taught so much it would rub off on anyone sitting close. I did not expect to meet people who wore their titles like armor and spent their days deciding which students were furniture and which were targets. I did not expect the way their voices would sit in your head after class and make you feel smaller than the desk. I did not expect to spend my junior and senior years building a structure that would collapse them. But that's what happened. My name is Mateo. I arrived on campus with a second-hand duffel, a laptop that ran hot if you did anything fancy, and a habit of keeping my head down. The engineering building smelled like dust, solvents, and old air conditioning. I loved it. I loved the echo of my footsteps before 8 a.m., the feeling of being the first person to switch on a lab's fluorescent lights and watch the room decide it was alive. Freshman year was work but not complicated. Calculus that walked like a tide and kept coming back. Physics that made you feel like you had a grip on the world if you memorized enough constants. The professors then were brisk, sometimes bored, but not cruel. I learned the routes between classrooms and vending machines, learned where to sit so a question would land without becoming a scene, and learned how the campus libraries hummed differently in the afternoon than at night. I took systems design with Professor Keene. On the first day, he came in 5 minutes late and wrote his name across the whiteboard like a signature on a check. He was 50-ish, with a face that always looked like it had just noticed something wrong in your posture. People said he was a genius, that he had redesigned a municipal water control system a weekend once when a flood threatened a county. People said he was the reason our department had money. He didn't bother with a syllabus beyond the dates of the midterm and final and a list of chapters that looked like someone had pulled them out of a hat. "This is a professional environment," he said. "If you can't operate like professionals, there are easier degrees to get." He smiled then, a small thing that felt like a trap being set. The first time I answered a question in his class, he stopped me 3 words in, tilted his head, and asked if English was my first language. I said yes and swallowed whatever else my throat wanted to hand me. He nodded like I had confirmed something and said I needed to tighten how I spoke, because engineers don't have time to translate. A girl across the aisle looked down at her notebook as if the lines there might hide her from the moment. I told myself he treated everyone that way. He didn't. He liked a certain kind of student, loud, confident American without adjectives, and he let them be wrong noisily while he cut people like me for breathing too carefully. You learn survival tricks. Don't ask questions in front of him. Ask the TA. Sit on the edges. Give your eyes somewhere else to live during lecture. And then one day you forget because the material finally aligns with a question you've had since you were 15, and you raise your hand and say, "What if?" And he says, "We're not doing hypotheticals, we're doing engineering." And the room rustles and the men he likes smirk and something inside you closes a door. The door stays shut longer each week. Midterm came. I studied the way you study when failure feels like proof of a dozen people's worst guesses about you. I slept badly, memorized problem patterns, and did the practice exam twice. In the actual exam, he included a question about a system diagram he had shown once and then brushed aside. The diagram in the exam was not the same. It had a valve where there had been a pump and a sensor where there had been a controller. He wanted you to pretend it hadn't changed and solve for an output that no longer existed. 30% of the class failed the exam. He posted the distribution and wrote, "This is what happens when you're not serious." He curved nothing. I would have survived Keene if he had been a weather system, if he were just one bad season you put your head down and lived through. He wasn't a storm. He was a climate. He chaired the undergraduate committee. He decided who got the department's small scholarships and who got shoved into courses they didn't want. He signed off on independent study proposals, and when he signed yours, he read it in front of you like a judge granting bail and said things like ambitious, when he meant try something smaller so I don't have to watch you fail. By late spring, I had a plan for a capstone project. A low-cost sensor array that could be installed along storm drains to predict localized flooding on streets the city never bothered to map properly in their models. It was the kind of thing you could build with parts that didn't require you to sell your car. and it felt like something that mattered beyond a grade. I wrote it up carefully. Objectives, methodology, bill of materials, pilot deployment, data analysis, risks, known unknowns. I asked Dr. Vale to be my advisor. Vale was new, quiet. A woman with hair she pinned up in a way that looked like it should fall and never did. She said yes, but warned me she'd have to run it through the committee. The committee was keen. He called me into his office 3 weeks into summer. He didn't offer a chair. The committee has concerns, he said, pressing his fingers together like a prayer he didn't believe in. Your budget is unrealistic. Your timeline is naive. Your data plan is dash. He paused. Scrolling an email I could see reflected in his glasses. Ambitious. He looked up. We can't approve it as written. What would make it approvable? I asked. We've been thinking, he said with the kind of we that means I, that this would be better as a joint project under an existing grant. Dr. March has a city contract. If you fold your work into his, you'll get access to resources you can't imagine. I met March once. He ran the urban systems lab and smiled like you were an undercooked steak. He liked students who could be sent to community meetings to collect quotes for reports he put his name on. He liked being photographed near municipal logos. I didn't want to be folded. I wanted to build my little array and see where water would be before it arrived. I'd like to keep it independent, I said. Keen smiled, the tiny needle of it. Independence is a luxury, he said. You don't know how these things work yet. March can shepherd you. Is Dr. Vale not allowed to do that? I asked. He tapped his desk with one finger and said, We're done. 3 days later, my proposal appeared in a departmental newsletter under the heading New Pilot Embedded within Citywide Smart Drainage Initiative. The language was mine, bent. The diagram was mine. The name at the top of the short update was March's. In the second paragraph, with advising from Professors March and Keene. It did not include my name. It did not mention Vale. I walked to Vale's office and stood in the doorway like someone barefoot at the edge of a road. She looked up, saw my face, and closed her laptop. I showed her the newsletter on my phone. She stared for a long time in a way that made time feel like a flat circle. I didn't know, she said. I wasn't told. I don't want to be shepherded, I said. My throat was too dry for volume. I know, she said. She folded her hands and unfolded them and looked at the bookcase, as if a book there might have a chapter named, What to Do When Your Senior Colleagues Cut Your Knees. I will talk to them. Nothing changed. March sent me an email 2 days later with a cheery subject line dash, excited to integrate, and 3 attachments. A non-disclosure agreement that would assign anything I produced to his lab, a community engagement plan where students were listed as facilitators, and a timeline with my projection copied and pasted, but the milestones shifted to dates that coincided with his grant reporting deadlines. We'll get you a small stipend if you sign quickly, he wrote, like a loan shark offering you a chair to sit in while you give him your wallet. I didn't sign. I didn't reply. I met Vale again. She said she had pushed back and been told this is how things are done here. They think they're protecting you, she said. And then she looked like she wanted to bite her own tongue for making that sound like anything but what it was. The fall semester began like you start walking again after tripping. You pretend the trip didn't happen because if you adjust your stride to it, you'll fall harder later. I took Keene's advanced systems because there was no way around him if you wanted the degree. I worked at a campus job shelving book. I kept sketching the sensor array, not because I thought anyone would let me build it, but because the drawing felt like a way to remember my own hands. Then, a month in, the first thing happened that made me understand I was not dealing with a theft. I was dealing with a machine. A friend in March's lab, Tim, who had a laugh that sounded like a hiccup he never recovered from, texted me a photo of a slide from March's talk at a city council workshop. It was my diagram. The date on the slide was older than my proposal, which meant March had either backdated it to make it look like his, or Keene had sent him my draft over the summer, and he had shoved it into his slide deck without changing the footer. The slide had a little March Lab watermark in the corner like someone peeing on a tree. Something in me went still. Anger has temperatures. I reached the one where everything slows down enough to see. I went home and opened a new folder on my computer and named it Index. I started putting things in it. The newsletter, the slide photo, my original draft with metadata intact, an email from Keen in which he used my phrasing to reject my phrasing. I scanned my notebook pages in case the notebook had an accident. I called my sister and talked about our father's insistence that you save receipts even if you bought something small, and I heard her voice change when she realized I was not talking about groceries. A week later, I sent March a short email. I noticed my diagram in your council slide. It appears to have been modified. I'd like to discuss attribution. He replied with a paragraph from the Manual of Men Who Believe Apology is a Currency They Cannot Spend. In a fast-moving project like this, we often iterate collectively. It's sometimes difficult to ascribe individual elements, but rest assured your contributions are appreciated. He CC'd Keen. He CC'd Vale. He did not use my name in the email's body. The attached NDA remained attached. I could have gone to the department chair. The chair played golf with Keen and used we, the way a ship captain uses it when the ship is not letting you steer. I could have gone to the dean. The dean's office framed alumni checks like art. I wrote letters to both anyway and saved them in drafts. Then I waited. There are systems inside universities for when harm becomes too loud to ignore. Research integrity offices, Title IX, ombudspersons who sit behind glass and hand your pamphlets about your rights. I visited the research integrity site late one night, read the definitions of plagiarism and misappropriation, followed links until the language thinned into policy air. I wrote to the integrity office with a subject line that would not trip anyone's reflex to close the window. Question about attribution norms. I described carefully what had happened, including dates and images. I did not accuse. I asked for guidance. They replied with an auto-acknowledgement and the promise someone would contact me in 10 business days. During those 10 days, Keen asked me a question in class, and when I answered it correctly in 3 sentences, he asked for the 4th sentence and then told me I was hand-waving. I felt the room do the thing rooms do when they smell blood. After class, he called me to the front and said without looking at me, "I hear you've been making noise. Be careful. You'll find people less inclined to hire a complainer." He smiled then and said, "Friendly advice." I started waking at 3:03 a.m. There was no reason for that time. It wasn't a number that mattered to me. It arrived like an appointment set by a calendar I didn't own. I would stare at the ceiling and count backward from 100 and listen to the apartment above mine where someone was living a life that I wanted to trade for. A life where the loudest sound at 3 in the morning is the refrigerator deciding to breathe. The integrity office wrote back on day 9. They said the situation raised concerns and that I could file a formal complaint if I wished, with supporting documentation. They reminded me that the office handles patterns, not isolated incidents. They also told me that because March's grant involved the city, any formal allegation could trigger a review by the grant's program officer, which is the academic version of telling someone to get their house in order because the county inspector is coming. I filed a complaint. I attached the newsletter, the slide, my draft, my emails, a letter from Vale stating she had not been consulted before my project was integrated. I made a timeline and numbered it and stopped myself from adding adjectives. I used only nouns and verbs. I put the PDF in the index folder and named it something that would look boring on a screen if someone ever saw it by accident. 2 weeks have passed. Nothing and everything happened. In lecture, Keen kept being Keen. In March's public postings, the diagram kept showing up. In the hallway, I heard a grad student say to another, "Don't get crosswise with Keen. He'll make your life an elective you never pass." My stomach did something with air. I kept going. The office wrote again saying they were conducting a preliminary assessment and would be in touch. In my head, that sentence sounded like a very patient person trying to talk someone off a ledge with a manual written in a language nobody speaks. I wasn't the kind of person who keeps the receipts for other people's lives. And then I started talking to people quietly. You learn fast who needs no convincing because they've been waiting for someone to ask. A woman from my circuits class, Alina, told me Vale had been edged out of a course development project by Keen Midsummer. A TA told me March had a practice of requiring undergrads to volunteer at public meetings and then used their notes verbatim in reports without credit. Someone else told me a faculty member had left last year after a tenure vote that stank of something more than scholarship. None of this would matter to an office that needed timestamps and exhibits. But it mattered to me because it meant I wasn't alone, and if revenge is ever anything but a stupid costume for pain, it's a thing people build together in whispers until it sounds like a plan. I widened the index. I made subfolders: attribution, exams, grants, emails, policies, public. I used the university's own records against them. It's astonishing how much a place that prizes control posts online when it wants to brag. I downloaded grant abstracts, committee minutes, faculty meeting agendas. I read the faculty handbook until the words felt like a fever. I watched March's presentations to City Council and archived them in case he decided to tidy later. I found a slide where he said his lab had pioneered low-cost flood sensors 5 years ago, which would have been a neat trick given that 5 years ago his lab had been focused entirely on a parking app. I found a line in Keen's CV about mentoring over 120 undergraduate innovators, and then I went into the departmental alumni site and looked for those innovators. Some were real people with jobs. Some didn't exist beyond that line. Innovator turned out to be a word you could throw at anyone who had touched one of his projects and not sue him. And then the exam happened. Keen liked to spring quizzes that counted for 15%. He called them engagement checks. One appeared on a Wednesday in late October. He put 2 problems on the board. One about a feedback loop that would oscillate if you breathed wrong near it. One about a system with delays and nonlinearities that looked standard until you noticed the constraint buried in a sentence at the end. I worked fast, got to the constraint, realized the problem as written had no solution because the initial conditions contradicted the physical limits he had included in another line. I wrote, instead of an answer, a short note. Given your constraints, no steady state exists. If those constraints are a typo and you meant X, the solution is Y. I put my work on his desk and left class angry with a hot, foolish hope that this would be the time the world rewarded you for seeing the thing that didn't fit. He failed me for insubordination. He wrote that word on the returned paper. He gave everyone else partial credit for reasonable assumptions. I went to his office. He summoned the professional environment again and said I was trying to perform cleverness. I asked why a student who wrote an assumption that made the problem solvable received points while a student who noticed the impossibility received none. Because they tried, he said. You tried to show me up. He smiled in the way he smiled when he wanted you to remember who kept the grade book. I took a photo of the paper with insubordination. I put it in the index under exams. I sent a screenshot to the integrity office and asked carefully whether retaliatory grading fell under their scope. They wrote back saying I should go through the appeal process and that my other concerns were under review. And even in email you could hear the weary kindness of someone who has said that sentence 100 times to people who didn't have the time to fight a system designed to tire you out. You cannot outshout a person like Keen. You can outlast them if you find ways to be louder where it counts. I started writing a document for myself called The Ledger. It wasn't a diary. Diaries are for the parts of you that need to be soft. The ledger was for the parts that needed steel. Each day I wrote down what had happened related to the case, 3 lines maximum, with receipts attached. I noted the time I emailed March and the time he replied. I noted when Vale spoke up in a faculty meeting and when she didn't, not to judge her but to understand when the machine made her smaller. I noted the phrases that kept repeating, professional environment. We're protecting you. We can't approve it as written. Insubordination. I noted how many students were in class every Wednesday and how many fewer on Fridays. I noted when the door of Keen's office was shut for more than an hour, and March's door shut too, and a certain assistant dean walked by and glanced at both doors like a man checking the load-bearing walls of a building he might have to deny permits to if someone asked. In November, the integrity office asked to meet. They offered a small conference room with chairs that made you feel like you were waiting for the dentist. 2 people from the office came. A woman who introduced herself as Claire and a man who didn't introduce himself at all and wrote down everything like he was collecting sentences the way other people collect currency. They asked me to walk them through my complaint. I did, letting the documents do the work and my voice do the least. When I mentioned the exam, Claire asked me if I had appealed. I said the appeal lands on Keen's desk unless you can prove bias. She made a face that said she knew that already and hated it, but that wasn't what we were doing in this room. The man asked me whether I had signed March's NDA. I said no. He nodded as if I had said the answer he hoped for because it made math easier. They said they would talk to March and Keen and Vale, and they would ask for drafts, emails, and version histories. They said they would look at grant documentation to see whether the project integration was properly recorded. They told me the word plagiarism is heavier when money is attached to it, and that March's city contract could turn a concern into a finding. They also, because this is the tired choreography of these conversations, reminded me that there could be professional repercussions for everyone, which was a way to say, brace yourself without saying, you will be punished for telling the truth whether or not we help you. That week Vale knocked on the library study room where I was pretending to be a person who could focus. She closed the door and sat across from me without looking directly at me for a long moment, the way you sit diagonally from a grave when you don't want to read the name yet. They talked to me, she said. I told them what happened. Will it matter? I asked. She looked at her hands. I don't know, she said. But March is worried. He asked me to sign a statement that the integration was mutual. I declined. Thank you, I said, and meant it in a way that made my lungs hurt. Mateo, she said, finally looking at me. If this goes the way I think it could, it won't just be March. Keen will come for you. He already did, I said. She nodded. Then don't be alone when it happens. I took that like a prescription. I started collecting not just documents but people. I found Alina again and asked her if she'd be willing to talk to the office about the course development thing. She said yes and cried in a stairwell afterward because telling the truth makes you shake when you've spent a year telling yourself the door was locked. I talked to a grad student, Marcus, who had spent a summer writing code for March without pay because that's how you get in the room, and then watched March publish a report with that code as if it had written itself. I spoke to a community organizer who had sat through 5 of March's public meetings and never once heard a student introduced by name. I sent Claire their names with their permission, and each time I hit send I felt like I was placing a brick on a wall that might hold. Winter has come. The campus pretended to be peaceful with lights on the trees and carols in the dining hall while inboxes filled with final project panic. Keen announced the final would be cumulative. I studied anyway, out of reflex more than belief that it would be reciprocated. The night before the exam, I walked to the engineering building just to see it sit there in the cold, and I watched through the glass as March met with 2 city people in a classroom and pointed at maps and said things I couldn't hear. He gestured at the drain diagram on the screen mine. Still, and I felt calm that had nothing to do with forgiveness settled on me. I took out my phone. I did not record videos. I took a single photo of the room without faces in it. I put it in the index. I went home. The exam had 3 questions that required the kind of assumptions that teach you more about the professor than the subject. I wrote my work in small letters that looked like they were trying not to be noticed. When it was over, Keen collected the papers with a smile that would look the same whether the grades were good or bad. In the hallway afterward, someone laughed loudly enough to sound like bravado, and someone else said, "I'm screwed." And someone else said a prayer with another name for it, and we dispersed the way people do after an event that doesn't deserve the word. Grades posted 2 days later. I passed the course by 3 points. The grade on the exam was a number that suggested he had looked at my name and decided I had learned exactly the minimum I needed to escape him. I didn't argue. I didn't appeal. I saved the screenshot and closed the tab. The integrity office sent an email the next morning. The preliminary assessment had found sufficient merit to pursue a formal inquiry. That meant a committee. That meant document requests that did not sound like requests. January was quiet on campus, the way a town is quiet after a parade where people threw bottles for fun. I worked in the library and slept. I visited home and endured my uncle asking if engineers still build bridges or just apps now, and nodded my way through the kind of conversation you have with people who know you only as a version of yourself you outgrew and you're too tired to explain. When I returned, Claire asked me to meet again. She told me the committee had uncovered version histories that showed my diagram in March's files with my file name still in the properties. She told me they had emails from Keen forwarding my draft to March with a subject line that said, "Use this." She told me that I should prepare for retaliation and that the office would monitor the situation, and I almost laughed because monitoring sounds like protection if you say it softly enough. But really, it's a pair of eyes in a room full of hands. The committee interviewed March. He called it a misunderstanding. He said integration is messy. He said he had intended to add my name later, that the newsletter had been produced by a staffer without his input, that the slide deck had been a rush job. He did not explain the backdated date. The committee interviewed Keene. He said innovation flourishes when ideas are shared, that he had been protecting me from overreach, that my insistence on independence suggested I didn't understand how academics cohere. He used verbs like shepherd and fold in ways that made my body feel heaviness it didn't have the vocabulary for. The committee interviewed Vale again. She told them the truth. She told them the word plagiarism without putting a question mark at the end. Meanwhile, the semester's first week began. Keene taught control theory. March taught urban analytics. I was in neither of their classes by design, but I still had to walk past their doors. In the hallway, Keene's laugh sounded louder, like men laugh when they're waving to people outside the restaurant window and want the whole street to know they can afford lunch here. March posted a selfie with a city official and wrote, "Excited for 202X deliverables." As if exclamation points were proof of anything but noise. Two things happened in February that moved the machine. First, a reporter from the student paper, a woman with square glasses and a small scar above her eyebrow that made her look a little unafraid, emailed me. She said she'd heard there were authorship concerns in engineering and asked if I would talk on background. I said yes. I told her the facts. I gave her documents I was allowed to give. I didn't give her the names of other students because people deserve to choose their risk. She asked good questions. She checked. When the story ran, it was careful and made of verbs that didn't lie. A student alleges. Documents show. Committee is reviewing. The administration replied with a statement that was a soup of values and process. The piece didn't blow anything up. It did something more useful. It made it public knowledge that something was happening that had previously been happening only to me. Second, the city's program officer for March's grant requested a meeting with the department. I learned this from a forwarded email with a chain of so long it looked like a field of stitches. The program officer asked for a revised deliverables list and copies of any work products to date, including documentation of student contributions. That last phrase was a spear thrown with a smile. It took 2 weeks to schedule the meeting, and you could feel the department's temperature change. People were nicer in the hallway. The assistant dean replied to emails faster. The department chair sent an invitation to a community listening session no one had asked for. Keene canceled one class, which he never did, to prepare a report. March put on a suit. The day of the meeting, I sat in a library corral and pretended to study while feeling each hour like a curtain lifting or not lifting on a stage I couldn't see. I imagined the conference room. March smiling, Keene leaning back like a man who knows statistics but prefers stories. The chair arranging water bottles on the table, like making sure the optics include hydration will help. I imagined the program officer, an older woman maybe, who had seen a dozen versions of this and knew where the bodies tended to be buried. Around 4, Claire texted me something I didn't know she would do. She wrote, "It happened." I wrote, "What happened?" She replied, "You'll hear." An hour later I got an email from March. He wrote to me directly for the first time in months. He CC'd the chair and Keene and Vale and the program officer. He used my name twice. He said his lab would be issuing a correction to the newsletter and that my contributions would be recognized going forward. He said there had been confusion about the slide, which he regretted. He asked if I would join a meeting to reset the relationship. He ended with, "We value you." I closed my laptop and let the air sit. Then I opened it and wrote 5 sentences. "Thank you for the update. I appreciate the correction. Please send any documents that you would like me to review in advance. To ensure clarity, let's keep all correspondence in writing. I prefer to continue working with Dr. Vale as my advisor on my original project." I CC'd Claire. I CC'd the program officer. I hit send. I put the email in the index and named it Reversal. That could have been the end of it if the story were about a mistake being corrected. It wasn't a mistake. It was a habit. Habits don't leave because someone asked them to. They leave because you build a place where they don't fit anymore. The committee's report came out a month later. It used phrases like, inadequate attribution, and inappropriate integration. It is recommended that March issue a formal acknowledgement of my contribution and correct any public materials that suggested otherwise. It recommended mentoring training for Keen and added a paragraph about avoiding retaliatory grading practices, which was an elegant way to call insubordination a weapon. It did not use the word plagiarism with either of their names. It did not ask anyone to resign. The program officer followed up with a letter requiring the grant to document student roles on all deliverables and attach a signed attribution statement to each report. The department chair sent a message to the whole department reminding us of our values. If that had been all, I would have called it a drawer and watched my back for the rest of my time there. But I had the index. I had a ledger. I had people who were tired of being furniture. I had Vale, who had decided to stop choosing which parts of herself to hide. And I had one more card I hadn't played. In the weeks while the committee deliberated, I'd filed public records requests with the city for emails between March and any city official containing certain keywords. I learned that cities keep everything your emails say if you use their money to say it. When the records arrived, it was like hearing two strangers gossip about you through your own window. March had used my diagram in a dozen contexts. He'd shared it with a vendor who had given a quote that included my figure as a mock-up. He had told a colleague, "We have an undergrad working on this, but he'll be rolled into the lab deliverable." Rolled. He had written students love being part of something bigger, and the city official had replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I gave those emails to the student reporter. She wrote a second story. It quoted the program officer saying the city would update its practices to ensure proper student recognition. It quoted a council member who had sat through March's talks and had a memory for diagrams saying he was concerned. It included a screenshot of the rolled-in email with March's name redacted and the phrase highlighted. The story ran on Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, March had scrubbed his lab page of anything that looked like a delivery not already archived. He posted a new values statement about mentoring with integrity. The comment section below the student paper story did what comment sections do, and I closed my browser before the noise got on me. Keen retaliated anyway. He couldn't change my past grades. He tried to block my enrollment in a lab section I needed by claiming it had reached capacity. I emailed the registrar with the section's enrollment numbers, which I had because the department posted them. I CC'd the chair. The registrar enrolled me. Keen sent me an email with a subject line advice, and the body careful how you spend your last semester. I forwarded it to Claire and then archived it. I stopped going anywhere alone where he could be. I walked with other people in the hallway. I sat near exits. In April, the department held a colloquium. Keen was the speaker. The title was Leadership in Systems. The room was full. I went because sometimes you need to stand in the weather after the storm to see what's still wet. He talked about ethos and discipline. He talked about setting a standard. He smiled at the places where a smile signals you're making a joke without making one. People nodded. People who had been burned still nodded, because that's the cost of being dependent on a system for a recommendation letter. At the end, someone asked a question about attribution. He said, "We always credit our students." He said it with such conviction that if sound could be a photograph you could frame, someone would have bought that frame and hung it in their office. I didn't stand up. I didn't speak. I didn't need to, because the next day, the dean's office sent a memo. Effective immediately, all courses would include an authorship and attribution policy in their syllabi. All labs file student contribution statements each semester. The memo didn't mention me. It didn't need to. The index didn't need to say victory anywhere for me to know we had moved something. Graduation came with a hot sun. I shook hands with the chair. Keen looked at me and looked away. March smiled a small, fixed smile that made me think of glue. My family came. My sister squeezed my hand until it hurt. My mother asked me if I wanted a photo with any of my professors. I said no and then, after a second, said yes and asked Vale if she would stand next to me. She did. We smiled. It wasn't triumphant. It was something steadier. I could end here where the movie would. But revenge isn't a closing scene. It's a structure you live in. After graduation, I stayed in the city for a while. I took a job with a small firm that built sensors for places with small budgets. On weekends I worked with a neighborhood group to install a pilot version of my array on 3 blocks that flooded every time it rained more than an inch in 2 hours. We got the components donated. We coded in a basement. We zip-tied small lives to municipal mouths and listened, and for the first time in 2 years I felt like engineering had returned to being a language that didn't lie. A year later, I heard that March had transitioned to a new role at a consulting company that did the same work he'd done for the city except with a different logo. The lab went to someone else who didn't post selfies at council meetings. Students told me the new director said names out loud when they presented. Keene stayed. Of course he stayed. He gave a talk at a conference about ethics in engineering education. I saw the slide deck. It quoted the memo that had been written because of him. That's how some people survive. By learning the lyrics to the song their victims sang and then singing it back louder in a nicer suit. I am supposed to say here that I forgave. I didn't. Forgiveness feels like a religion for people who have time. What I did instead was decide on the scope of the project. My revenge wasn't burning their names down. It was taking their oxygen. It was building procedures they couldn't slither around without someone else noticing the trail. It was teaching first years when I volunteered 1 semester for a seminar, how to document their work not because their professors might steal it but because one day they might be the professor who forgets, and it's good to tie your hands to the mast. It was answering emails from students who heard my name through a whisper network and wanted to know how to make a folder that would protect them. Sometimes I dream about a different version. In it, I knock on Keene's door with Pilot beside me, the dog I adopted after college, who looks at me like I might know the answer to a question dogs don't ask, and I say nothing while he opens a file cabinet and takes out a piece of paper and writes, "I'm sorry," and signs it with his whole name. He hands it to me and I put it in the index and it glows. It's a stupid dream. People like him don't apologize for the harm. They apologize for the inconvenience of being caught. I don't need his sentence. I wrote my own. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is not the banal document everything you see on small posters in career centers. It's decide what you are building. Because revenge can be an explosion you watch from a hill or a building you live in. I built something with other people's hands helping when they were brave enough to lend them. It has a lobby with names on the wall of everyone who said, "Me too," and meant it, and hallways with doors that open to rooms where students are not furniture. It has windows you can open in spring to let the air in. It has a rule posted near the elevator that says, "Say the names of the people whose work you are standing on out loud in public every time." I keep the index on a drive I back up in 2 places. Sometimes I open it and scroll, not to remind myself I won, but to remind myself what it takes to make a place safer by 1 centimeter. The folder names are boring on purpose. Attribution, exams, grants, emails, policies, public. There is a final folder called After, and it contains only 1 file. A photo of the first flood sensor we installed blinking green after a storm that would have flooded a basement if we hadn't told a man 6 blocks over to move his car before the water rose. In the photo, the street looks the same as it always has. The difference is a thing you can't see. A kid who didn't have to miss school the next day to help his mother sweep water out the front door. I don't think about Keene when I look at that photo. I don't think about March. I think about the way systems change only when people take the parts that don't fit and refuse to file them down to suit the machine. I think about how you can make revenge big enough that it stops being about a man and becomes about a place. I think about my younger self, the one who was told to tighten his words, and I want to tell him he doesn't have to earn his right to speak by making the sentence shorter. He can take the time he needs. On the night before I left the city for the job I have now, I walked past the engineering building one more time. The lights were on in a few rooms. A student sat alone beneath a whiteboard with diagrams that looked familiar in the way math looks familiar even when you don't know it yet. The door to Vale's office was open. She wasn't there, but the plant on her windowsill had grown enough to touch the glass. In the lobby, there was a new poster listing the department's attribution policy. It was a small thing with text too small for anyone to read unless they wanted to. I stood there and read it anyway, line by line, the way you sometimes read a list of names on a memorial not because you know any of them but because someone should. On my way home, I passed the bulletin board where undergrad research posters go when the semester ends. There were names everywhere, with and between them, not under. It's possible those posters would have looked like that without me. It's possible this is all confirmation bias and a man flattering himself after a long fight. But I let myself believe that a few more ants were there because we made noise at the right frequency and the building shook for a second and pieces fell into better places. This is the story. It doesn't end with a fire. It doesn't end with a handcuff. It ends with a policy, a correction, a committee's language that will be quoted by people who don't know my name. It ends with a sensor blinking green and a street not underwater. It ends with me sleeping past 3:03 and waking to make coffee and knowing I didn't let the worst people teach me what engineering is. It ends with the understanding that some professors are toxic because nobody ever made them drink their own work, and the best revenge is making a world where their mouths are too dry for the lies to come out smoothly. It ends with me walking out of a building and not looking back because I don't owe it my eyes anymore. If you're a student reading this somewhere between assignments and a shift and wondering whether the fight is worth what it will take out of you, I don't have a slogan. I have a folder structure, a list of dates, and a belief that you can aim harm at one person, or you can aim at the part of the world that lets a person do harm and keeps calling it mentoring. Aim at the structure. Make it grown. Make it change its shape enough that the people who come after you can sit in a classroom and ask, what if, without being told their voices are wrong for the room. I didn't go to college to fight a war. I did anyway. I learned more from that war than from any lecture Keen ever gave. And I built something that will keep standing when he stops talking. That's enough.